I love horror. Films, TV shows, books, but if you ask me, nothing quite beats the true terror of a horror video game. And there's been no shortage of greats over the years, from the original Alone in the Dark, Silent Hill, all the way through to games like Amnesia and the Dead Space series. Every Halloween, I dive into Steam and look for a new game to scare me senseless. But this year, I noticed something a little strange. When I went under the horror tag on the store and sorted by user reviews to discover the best of the best, I noticed I didn't recognize the majority of the games. Have we discovered a hidden trove of terrifying tales, or are Steam user reviews just rubbish? I thought I'd go through the supposedly best top 25 horror games, not bundles or DLC, just games, on Steam to ask, are they any good? And more importantly, are they scary? Welcome to the Steam 25 Horror. Sat at the number 4 spot is Dusk, a retro-inspired FPS that sees you sprinting around farms, spooky factories, and haunted cities as you search for keys and items, all the while blasting every strange, horrific monster that tries to take a bite out of you. With a campaign spanning 3 episodes, each comprising of several levels, an endless horde mode, multiplayer, and a whole collection of difficulty modes and secrets to find, the game is full of different places to go and blast the heads of chainsaw-wielding maniacs. So, is it any good? Before I sit down to properly play any of the games on this list, I always boot the game up the night before, mainly just to get the settings set up all right, maybe play through the tutorial just to make sure I understand the game. I decided to play the first few minutes of this game just to get a feel for it. I ended up playing most of the first episode in one night. We'll come back to this later, but right off the bat, it's a wildly addictive game. A lot of games have tried to recapture the look of classic games, to varying degrees of success. Something Dusk manages to do both here and in a lot of its key areas is find a wonderful mix between that old and new. It looks much better than the early 90s FPSs it's echoing, but still clearly resembles them. In other words, it takes what works and evolves what didn't. The areas are still covered in big 2D walls and strange pointy geometry, but enemies and certain objects like explosive barrels are changed to more full 3D to help make movement and positioning a little clearer. Most of the items even have physics attached and can be thrown around at enemies if you're low on ammo. Most of the enemy designs themselves are a lot of fun, though some of the later soldier enemies feel infinitely less inspired and interesting compared to the shrieking cultists and shotgunning scarecrows from early on. Ultimately, it's a game with a strong visual style and influence, but one that's smart enough to prioritize gameplay and allow newer graphical ideas into the game over just being entirely religiously faithful to the past. Great though the visuals are, the real winner here is the gameplay. That's what kept me hooked when I first sat down to play. The game feels fast even by retro shooter standards. Weapons reload quickly, and with the addition of an incredibly fast slide move, you'll be flying around the battlefield. Combat also feels greatly satisfying. While most of the enemies can certainly take a good few rounds, the staggers, noises, and blood that flies off them each hit means every connected shot feels weighty. I played on the recommended difficulty and found the enemies to be fairly manageable, but never did they feel entirely powerless. The mix of different attack styles, chainsaws running at you while zombie scarecrows conjure knives and attack from a distance, strongly encourages you to keep on the move. Frequent drops of health potions from killed enemies, and often large maps full of bounce pads, shelters, and ammo, all continues to encourage movement, to play into the fast-paced nature of the game rather than fight it. Much like the retro games of the past, secrets are hidden throughout every level, and can feature rewards from health to a strange new weapon. All of this creates a nice core gameplay loop. Fast action moments as you zip around, sliding and blasting, then quiet tense moments as you open doors looking for secrets, but being wary of enemies hiding around corners. The gameplay is gripping and addictive, pushing you to always keep moving in fast-paced and punchy combat. This leads nicely into pacing. Something that can often bog down games like this is repetition. How do you ensure killing the same enemies with the same weapons will remain engaging? On the whole, while there are a few weak moments, Dusk does a good job of keeping the pace strong. The mix of levels really helps with this. The game frequently jumps between huge sprawling hubs to tense small caverns and makes sure to mix in different enemies accordingly. Going through mine shafts being chased feels very different to bouncing around cities dodging bullets. The game also introduces new enemies to keep you on your toes at a pretty healthy rate, The tail end of the first episode and the first half of the second feel a little weaker here, but these moments aside, the game mixes in new, varied enemies fairly generously. The same can be said for weapons. There are around 10 weapons in the game, and they each feel nicely rationed throughout the first episode. Each feels unique in some way, and each packs a little kick. The later episodes certainly struggle a little without any new weapons, but do introduce new power-ups that change how you move around the world. For the most part, the pacing is spot on, and ultimately, any lapses there weren't enough to actually stop me wanting to continue playing. So Dusk is pretty good. The mix of old and new breathed new life into this formula with wonderfully fast shooting, nicely designed and staggered levels, as well as mostly colourful and interesting enemies. But, is it scary? Like all the games I look at here, I switched all the lights off, plugged in some headphones, and really set the mood to spooky, to give the game the best shot it could at making me shiver. So, is it scary? Not massively. In the balance of action-horror, the game is leaning heavily to the side of action. That works to aid the gameplay, but certainly hinders the game's horror potential. Something that does massively help, however, is the audio. I wanted to save the sounds for the spooky side of this discussion, because it's here the balance feels much more on the horror side. When combat gets tense, a heavy metal sounding track will play, but in between the score is often very much that of a classic horror movie. The music gives the quiet in-between moments a little more terror. The heavy beats in the score and often gently rising music gives the feeling of constantly being one moment away from an attack. The sounds of the enemies in the world are also great tone setters. Hearing the chainsaw or a cultist calling you a non-believer before you see them can get you a little tense as you go forward knowing something is about to leap out at you. The world is full of scratching noises and rumbles, again giving you that constant feeling that something is around the bend. Some of the later enemy designs are a little monstrous, though nothing that'll keep you up at night. The sounds and audio do most of the heavy lifting here in terms of horror, and while getting cornered by some creepy looking monster can be frightening, it's clearly a more action-oriented game than it is horror. Would I recommend it? For the amount of fun I've had, and continue to have, I would strongly recommend this game. As someone who isn't even a huge fan of retro FPSs, I found this stupidly addictive, and while the pace can occasionally lull and some of the designs can be a little dull, it's never enough to really throw you out of the game, or distract from the brilliantly fast gameplay loop. As horror, it's not the worst I've played here, but it's far from the best. If you're looking for a good, spooky Halloween game, this might not be it. But, if you want an FPS with a little horror mixed in, then this should more than suffice. Here's where it falls on the ranking table. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like, a comment, and hey, maybe even subscribe. Hope this has been helpful, and look forward to seeing you next week in the Steam 25 Horror. See you then.